So the Bible reading is taken from Mark chapter 14, verses 32 to 72. They went to a place called Gethsemane, and Jesus said to his disciples, "Sit here while I pray." He took Peter, James, and John along with him, and he began to be deeply distressed and troubled. "My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death," he said. "Stay here and keep watch." Going a little farther, he fell to the ground and prayed that if possible, the hour might pass from him. "Abba, Father," he said, "everything is possible for you. Take this cup away from me. Yet not what I will, but what you will." Then he turned to his disciples and found them sleeping. "Simon," he said to Peter, "are you asleep? Couldn't you keep watch for me for 1 hour? Watch and pray, so that you will not fall into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak." And once more he went away and prayed the same thing. And when he came back, he again found them sleeping, because their eyes were heavy. They did not know what to say to him. Returning to the third time, he said to them, "Are you still sleeping and resting? Enough. The hour has come. Look, the Son of Man is delivered into the hands of sinners. Rise, let us go. Here comes my betrayer." And just as he was speaking, Judas, one of the 12, appeared, and with him was a crowd armed with swords and clubs, sent from the chief priests, the teachers of the law, and the elders. Now the betrayers had arranged a signal with them. "The one I kiss is the man. Arrest him and lead him away under guard." Going at once to Jesus, Judas said, "Rabbi," and kissed him. The men seized Jesus and arrested him. Then one of those standing near drew his sword and struck the servant of the high priest, cutting off his ear. "Am I leading a rebellion," said Jesus, "that you have come with swords and clubs to capture me? Every day I was with you, teaching in the temple courts, and you did not arrest me. But the scriptures must be fulfilled." Then everyone deserted him and fled. A young man wearing nothing but a linen garment was following Jesus. When they seized him, he fled naked, leaving his garment behind him. They took Jesus to the high priest, and all the chief priests, the elders, and the teachers of the law came together. Peter followed him at a distance, right into the courtyard of the high priest. There he sat with the guards and warmed himself at the fire. The chief priests and the whole Sanhedrin were looking for evidence against Jesus so that they could put him to death. But they did not find any. Many testified falsely against him, but their statements did not agree. Then some stood up and gave this false testimony against him. "We heard him say, 'I will destroy the temple made with human hands, and in 3 days will build another one, not made with human hands.' Yet even their testimony did not agree." Then the high priest stood up before them and asked Jesus, "Are you not going to answer? What is this testimony that these men are bringing against you?" But Jesus remained silent and gave no answer. Again the high priests asked him, "Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One?" "I am," said Jesus, "and you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One, and coming on clouds of heaven." The high priests tore his clothes. "Why do we need any more witnesses?" he asked. "You have heard the blasphemy. What do you think?" They all condemned him as worthy of death Then some began to spit at him. They blindfolded him, struck him with their fists, and said, "Prophesy!" And the guards took him and beat him. While Peter was below in the courtyard, one of the servant girls of the high priest came by. When she saw Peter warming himself, she closely looked at him. "You also were with the Nazarene, Jesus," she said. But he denied it. "I don't know or understand what you're talking about," he said, and went out into the courtyard entryway. When the servant girl saw him there, she said again to one of those standing around, "This fellow is one of them." Again he denied it. And after a while, those standing near said to Peter, "Surely you are one of them, for you are a Galilean." He began to call down curses, and he swore to them, "I don't know this man you're talking about." And immediately the rooster crowed the second time. Then Jesus remembered the words Jesus had spoken to him. "Before the rooster crows twice, you will disown me 3 times. And he broke down and wept. This is the word of the Lord.
So we've been thinking about the journey to Jerusalem, haven't we, over a number of weeks, and we've focused and explored many things. But today I want to focus on Peter and his life, and I'm going to take us on a bit of a journey from his calling, and then bring together at the last part of the sermon this particular reading where Peter himself, of course, denies Jesus. So that's what I'm going to be doing today, is looking at Peter's journey right the way up until this point. Here we go. So Peter's journey. And I think you've heard that story. Have you heard that story? You're probably saying, what story? There was this school, and there was this long table at the school lunch break where, of course, all the children and young people were eating their food. And there was this large bowl of apples. But on this large bowl of apples, there was a sign which says, "Only take one, God is watching." Well, of course, at the other end of the table, there was a bowl of chocolate-chipped cookies. And one of the children had an idea. So they got their pencil out and wrote on the piece of paper, "Take them all, because God is watching the apples." Yes, I've heard that a few times now. God is watching. The thing is, when we say God is watching, take one, we immediately think God in a way where he's watching for every wrong move that we do or have. Not sure whether the child got in trouble with that one. Take them all, because God is watching the apples. This leads us to our first verse, which I want to look at. And now, this is not Mark's gospel. I want to take you to John 1:42, when first Peter encountered Jesus. And in what we'll look at, and he brought him to Jesus, and Jesus looked at him and said, "You are Simon, son of John. You will be called Cephas," which when translated is Peter. Do you know the thing that reminds me immediately? We can think of God watching in a negative way. But when Jesus first encounters Peter, Jesus looks at him. I find that interesting, the way that's recorded. Jesus looked at Simon Peter. What did he see? What did he see, I wonder? Do you know, when we come to church, there's always that thing, isn't it, that we come to church in our best. In other words, we come to church, or we should come to church, people say, with our best face on. So everything about us is presentable to God and also to the church. But you know, God sees through all of that. And God knows the heart. And you see, when Jesus looks at Peter, Simon Peter, he could see the person that Peter was. All of his faults, his heart, everything about Peter. But he also looked at Peter and saw the potential that Peter had. The very thing that Peter could become and not was. So Peter begins his journey. What about you? What do you do when you come to church? Do you put your best church face on? Maybe you're not so much here, but wear your hat and things like that, because we're somehow putting our religious hat on and as we stand before the body. But what about you? What does Jesus see when he looks at you? Well, I want you to be assured this morning that when Jesus looks at you, he can see the person that you could become. Not about age or whatever it is. Even as he looks at you now, he still sees that potential. Mistakes that have been made in the past, mistakes in the present. He sees the potential. Let's move on, because I just want to pick up a few things before we get on to Mark. And he brought him to Jesus, looked at him and says, "You are Simon, son of John. You will be called Cephas," which when translated is Peter. You are Simon, meaning a reed. Cephas in Aramaic and Peter in Greek, which means a rock. A reed is a very tall, thin plant that often grows by the rivers, but is easily swayed in the wind. So Simon the reed, straight and upright, but easily swayed, was to become Peter, the rock, a strong, a firm character. That was the plan that Jesus had for Peter. That no longer would be a thin reed that swayed in the wind. He would become the rock. But he's got a long way to go. And Jesus can see the potential in us. And he wants to change us into the person he tends us to be. The question is do you believe that, or are you simply happy with where and who you are? I know that I'm confident that he who began a good work in me will bring it to completion. And that work's not completed yet. There's a long way to go within me. What about you? Or are you just going to carry on thinking, it'll be okay? It'll be okay. I'll just carry on being who I am. That's fine. Let's look at the calling of Peter in Matthew chapter 14. Jesus says, "Come, follow me, and I will make you fishers of people." Come is an invitation. Follow me is a command. And I will make you is a promise. See, Jesus offers the invitation. He then offers the command and backs it up with a promise. This is really important as before we think about Peter's life and what he does at this last stage when he denies Jesus. So oftenly, we sometimes forget how far we've come as people. What does Peter do? Well, he leaves all. He left his successful business. Peter was a fisherman, a good trade, a successful business. So the thing that Peter did straight away was say, this calling from Jesus is far more important than any amount of money I have. He didn't know what the future was going to hold, but what we see with Peter is he trusted Jesus. Come, invitation. follow me command. I will make you promise. Peter accepted the invitation. He followed Jesus and he believed in the promise. What about you? What about when Jesus first asked you to come and follow him? Was you excited? Yeah? Or was you thinking, I've got my own version of Christianity which I'll just carry on living. But today, God still does the same, and he's doing that to you right now. He's asking you, are you willing to leave all? Are you willing to accept the invitation and come and follow me to see what I want to do in and through your life? Okay, well, if you carry on reading Peter through the Gospels, you will notice that Peter had ups, downs, twists and turns. He got things wrong. He got things right. Jesus told him off. But you know, when you look at Peter's life, you saw, I believe, throughout of his journey with Jesus that he began to change. And of course, if you read on right into the account, you'll see in Acts that God does some amazing stuff through Peter. Matthew 16:18, on this rock I will build my church. Through a reed that sways. So, what about when we now look at Mark's account as we've journeyed? Even now in Mark 14, you will all fall away, Jesus told them. But what does Peter say? Even if all fall away, I will not. You see, we still see Peter, the far from perfect Peter, still journeying with Jesus, still saying things. I've got a list of things here. Peter was self-confident, forceful, hasty, headstrong, outspoken, hot-headed, impatient. You're probably thinking, stop, Darren. But the thing is, Jesus loved Peter. And he loves you. And you see, he's called us all to follow him. He's called us all to live for him. To give our all for him. Because one day, what we sung earlier on, one day we will stand before the one. His face I at last shall see. Don't you want to be able to stand before Almighty Creator and say, you invited me to follow you, and I followed you. You asked me to give up much along the way, and I gave up much. Is that what you want with your life? It's what I want with my life. I'm not saying I get it always right, but it's what I want. I want to be able to stand before the one day and say, I've given you my everything. It's an amazing journey because we continue in Mark. What happens now? Jesus says, truly I tell you, Jesus answered, today, yes, tonight, before the cock crows twice, you yourself will disown me 3 times. And do you know what makes it worse now? Is Peter makes out Jesus to be a liar, because he says to Jesus, but Peter insisted emphatically, even if I have to die with you, I will never disown you. Don't you love Peter? Don't you just love... I love Peter because there's times, I'm sure, if we looked at Peter's life, we could all see ourselves in him. We say things which we know we probably shouldn't say. Maybe we've even made promises to Jesus which we haven't kept. Self-confident, forceful, hasty, headstrong, outspoken, hot-headed, impatient. Peter insisted emphatically, even if I have to die with you, I will never disown you. Then what happens? We move to the next slide, because we move into Garden of Gethsemane. Then he returned to his disciples and found them sleeping. Simon, he said to Peter, are you asleep? Couldn't you keep watch for 1 more hour? Have you noticed Jesus doesn't call him Peter? What does he call him? Simon. He's not become the person yet that Jesus intended him to be. But you know, Jesus doesn't give up. That's what we love about Jesus, is while we're still living and breathing, while we still have life in us walking on this earth, Jesus never ever gives up on anybody. He still uses preachers like me and to keep on preaching the gospel in the hope that people turn to the one, which is him. Simon, he said to Peter, are you asleep? After all those promises that Peter made, Peter couldn't even stay awake, could he? And I know it's difficult when you're absolutely shattered. You know as soon as you get your head comfortable. I'm speaking for myself now. I think I probably need to enter the Guinness World Book of Records, I think, apparently Suzanne reckons. She says, because as soon as my head hits the pillow, do you know, like countdown? It's sort of just, I think I'm snoring apparently before she's even sort of got her head comfortable. So I tend to go to sleep. Was I snoring last night? I was, you see. So I know, I feel for Peter, because when Peter was tired, I just go to sleep. And if I'm having sleepless nights, it's normally pretty serious, I have to say, because I can get to sleep fairly quickly anywhere. You know, without realizing, we can go back to our old selves. You know, Corinthians tells us if anyone is in Christ, they are a new creation. The old that's the way it's gone. But here you see there was something about Jesus calling Peter Simon. Maybe it was to do with his old self. What about you? Do you remember when you first made your commitment to Jesus Christ? And somehow your life changed. And I don't know, about 10 or 20 years on, it could be 30, 40, 50. I found an 1863 coin. It could have been then. No, I'm joking. But the thing is, do you remember looking back and making that commitment to Jesus and becoming a new person? But what about today? Have you lost that love for him? Do you know, it's easy, isn't it, for us sometimes, for our old selves to come back, isn't it? Because we lose the focus on what we're called to be for Jesus. How we're called to follow him. How we're called to give our all for him, because we've been coming to church and maybe some of us has got a little bit stale and we go back to the old way of thinking. Our old selves, a bit like Peter. I know I do. I do, honestly, because I can sometimes ponder back and think, Darren, why did you go into ministry for? You do. You look back and it's sometimes when you're not in a brilliant place with God or you're far away from him. And you almost can sometimes long for what used to be rather than what God's calling us to be in the present and the future. But what about you? Obviously, you can only speak for yourself. And it becomes more noticeable here as we journey through with Simon Peter, because what happens next? Well, from Gethsemane, guess what happens? They now go into the courtyard as John was speaking. Peter followed him at a distance. And I know that you think I like words sometimes, but as I'm preparing, there's certain words which really which come out. And there he sat with the guards and warmed himself at the fire. And there's two important words here, if you look at the account. Is Peter follows Jesus at a distance. How many of us sometimes follow Jesus at a distance? We're sort of just about in touch with him. We can just about see him. But we know that when he gets too close, maybe He calls us to things which we're not willing to accept. So if we follow him at a distance and we keep him at arm's length, we can somehow just manage to get him by. And Peter, you see, follows Jesus at a distance. And have you ever followed Jesus at a distance? Once you were so close to him. You were so close that you felt his presence and he was really leading you in your life. But over the years, you've just got a little bit more further away. And you still can see him, but you think, I can't be bothered. Shall I go to church today? Can I just encourage you, if you ever wake up and you feel like you don't want to go to church, get to church. Normally means that God's got something to say to you. It's easy to get up and say, let's get to church. We've had it. At times, me and Suzanne, we couldn't wait to get to church. There was 2 and 3 times a day we come to church. We used to live at church. And it's brilliant when times are like that. But when you wake up and think, I really could just do with an extra hour in bed. Shall I bother this morning? Get yourself up. Get yourself to church, because I guarantee you it's in those times God has got something to say to you. So Peter follows at a distance. Can anybody tell me why the fire is important for Peter? I'm going to fast forward this very briefly, but I'll rewind again. Because if you go to John 21, when Peter's reinstated on the shore, what does Jesus do? He lights a fire. And so at the time now where Peter's at a distance, he's about now to deny Jesus and disown him, the fire's there. And I believe in John 21, when Peter sees that fire, it will take him to the time when he denied Jesus. So how many denials were there? 1, 2, or 3 denials. Look what happens after the denials. Immediately the cock crowed the second time. Then Peter remembered the word Jesus had spoken to him. Before the cock crows twice, you will disown me 3 times. And what did Peter do? And he broke down and he wept. But you know, there's an interesting point here, because I want to make 2 points before I finish up today. This is this, as it will appear. If you look at the translation of this, you have to be careful you don't miss this. Because the translation, when Peter broke down and wept, suggests the more he thought of it, the more he wept. In other words, Peter, at that time, continued weeping. I love this quote. I picked it up from a lady in Uganda, and I can't remember her name. I'm sorry, the lady in Uganda, when I went out with her. But it says this: for Peter to become a rock, he needed to get to rock bottom. And I think this is a big turning point for Peter, actually, is we've journeyed with Peter. And in this text, in order for Peter to become that rock which Jesus intended, he needed to get to rock bottom. But you know, this weeping that Peter offered, it was a repentance. I can't imagine what he must have felt like after he'd denied Jesus. But he wept. But it was a weeping which suggesting, I'm so sorry. And we know that Peter loved Jesus. But I think this was a turning point for Peter, if I'm honest. For Peter to become a rock, he needed to get to rock bottom. What about you? Do you know when you're doing things in your own strength, in your own ways, because of your gifts and your talents and everything that you've got, you sort of don't need Jesus, do you? Because you can do it all yourself. But sometimes things have to be stripped away from us, that we have to be brought to rock bottom in order to call out to Jesus and say, please help. Now, if you notice from the time Peter disowned Jesus to John 21, post-resurrection, there would have been quite a period of time involved. And I think that period for Peter would have been a time of real reflection, a time of thinking about what he'd done. And then, of course, in John 21, let me just get my notes, I've nearly finished. In verses 9, he says, when they landed, they saw a fire of burning coals there with fish on it and some bread. You see, repentance and forgiveness are so important in our walk with God. And I want to encourage you as you come and receive today, if there's something that you need to place before God, place it before him today. Ask his forgiveness. But most importantly, receive it. And that's what Peter did in John 21. I thought this morning's sermon would take a slightly different route. We focused on Jesus all along, which is quite rightly so. But I thought then we'd pick up the journey of Peter. For Peter to become a rock, he needed to get to rock bottom. God bless you all, and amen.